Welcome to today's webinar on the good, the bad, and the ugly of Office 365 tenant-to-tenant migrations. Before we get started, there are just a couple things to run through. At this time, all lines are currently muted and they will be throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to us using the questions feature on the right-hand toolbar. This session is being recorded and a link will be shared to all registered attendees in the next day or so. So thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Mike Weaver, and I'm one of the product owners here at Quadrotech. I oversee our tenant-to-tenant migration product, Cloud Commander, and I'm really excited today to have Steve Goodman join us. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Steve Goodman. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office 365, long history with Exchange Server, and I work at a Microsoft partner called Content and Code.
Great. Thanks, Steve. It's good to have you here. So Steve, we got a pretty packed agenda here today. So we are going to go over just an introduction of the problem, and then we're going to get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of the problem at hand here. And we're going to go into more detail with the difficult. Steve has put together a real good selection of slides to really kind of wrap our heads around this problem in more detail. We've got a little bit of a debate talking about trends and what's going on in the space right now, so we can share what we're seeing live in the projects that we're working on, and then round it out with Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions as we go here. But briefly, why don't we just review the problem and why a lot of us are here. So at the beginning of Office 365 and even back to the BPAWS days, so the original version of the cloud computing platform, really the focus was keeping everything separate, and that's really still a focus today. We never want, the Pepsi tenant to see the Coke recipe. So the focus has really always been keeping data separated. And in this world of mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures and more, we've really found ourselves in a difficult situation where the service wasn't designed for it, but our businesses are. The other problem that we have is new services have gotten created that have had a really high adoption rate. They weren't really built with migrations in mind. A great example of this is Teams, which we're going to talk about in great detail of where we are today and where we're going in that. To kind of layer on the bad news, these projects are hard. We're going to talk about that today and be quite honest that there's some data that just doesn't migrate between tenants. There are other aspects where the data moves, but sometimes you have to do some manual intervention to get things to work post-move. And, we've all kind of adopted these really great quotas, and users have really enjoyed not really having email quotas or OneDrive quotas or SharePoint quotas. And this has really created a lot of content, and that can make it even harder to migrate because there's a lot of data volume, and sometimes the migration methods aren't really known for speed. These projects can have significant user impact. These are not just simple switches that we hit and suddenly they move and it's done. So this can really be difficult. And merger, acquisition, divestiture activity is just difficult to begin with. Those of us that have been through it before, it's a really big strain on organizations. There's a lot going on more than just IT. Even if we could 100% solve this with technology, there's still the political realities of organizations coming together, making it just a difficult project. But the good news is it does get better each day. We're seeing more and more options become available, and we are seeing this get a little easier as we go on, and Microsoft is certainly making changes to make this a little simpler. Here are some definitions that we just want to talk through very briefly because we're going to use these terms a lot in our discussion, so we just want to be sure we have it right. So we're going to talk about the difference between a staged and a cutover migration. So just to define these a little bit, so obviously you have your migration when you're going to actually move the data. A staged approach is when you're going to move users in waves, in groups, and not all at the same time. So you kind of think like a weekly wave or a daily wave where not all users will migrate between tenants at the same time. This is typically a situation with more than 500 users or more than 1,000 users, depending on the complexity of your project. And then a cutover migration is when it's a flash cut. Everyone's migrating at the same time. So you're going to hear us use that term a lot, stage migration and cutover migration. From the business standpoint, we have merger. So a merger is two firms that are coming together as equals. In reality, usually there is one driving it, but there are still every once in a while we'll run across these projects where there are two firms coming together and they want to move either to a new system together or try to still merge one of the systems, still kind of like an acquisition scenario. Acquisition, that's obviously when one company purchases another. So usually that's a larger firm purchasing a smaller firm, and usually the acquiring firm is driving the project. Divestiture, these can be really quite difficult, and you're going to hear, again, Steve and I mentioned these quite a bit. This is when you are selling off a division or a piece of your company into another company. They can be really difficult because there's concerns over data and who owns the data and ensuring that the right data is getting divested. In some cases, you're divesting to a competitor or someone that will be a competitor, so it's really important that that is right. Spinoffs are a little kind of nuanced to the divestiture where the stress is a little less. So this is sometimes a company is spinning off into another division that they're going to own or they're going to have a piece in for a while. So the control is still by you, so they're a little easier to get them done and executed. But there's still, maybe some concerns of getting the separation and things like that done. And finally, a transition service agreement, or a TSA. You may hear us refer to that a few times in the webinar as we refer to it as a TSA. And this is agreement, it's really typical in divestitures and spinoffs that define how IT services will move and be supported during transitions. If you're going through a divestiture or spinoff, it's really important that you do get understanding of what is in the TSA, and that'll help drive a lot of, we've actually had some kind of really urgent projects that I've seen, I don't know about you, Steve, where sometimes, we kind of get very late where the TSA expires with only a week or two to go and we're getting engaged very, very late in projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be one of the biggest challenges because we've not got very long to go before that expires. On the other hand, being early on in the process and getting ahead of this can solve a lot of the problems as well. So if there is perhaps a year after when the tenant migration itself will be, that might be long enough to manage some of the areas where, as we'll talk about later, not everything can literally be extracted from the service. And in a good situation with a transition service agreement, then that can be the crutch that can be used to meet some of those compliance requirements. Because unfortunately, if we were looking at this from a pure IT project where we wanted to get everything across from one platform to another, we weren't thinking of there being any transition period afterwards, then we'd often have a problem because we're not going to be able to get all that data out. So this could, and often is, one of the answers to dealing with some of the problems of what will be an imperfect migration.
Great. So as we start to get into the meat of the discussion here, we're going to go into a lot more detail in each one of these, but this is kind of a great overview slide. When we've been presenting at Ignite the Tour, this is kind of the slide that people are really taking away from them. So the good, the bad, the ugly. So when we kind of define this, the good, generally, and we'll go in more detail again, these are the items that move pretty easily or with minimal effort. The bad, these are things that don't move or are extremely difficult. And then we've got the ugly, which this category are they move, but there perhaps is a fair amount of work that we have to address to either make it happen or address it. So why don't we hop into the good here, Steve?
Yes.
Identity, you're up.
Yeah, so identity is one of those areas where it may not be as big a challenge as you expect, not because it's easy per se, but because you're usually going to follow what is well-trodden paths to get success. So identity for most organizations, for most people in this situation, is still tied to the on-premises Active Directory environment, which does mean that you don't need to consider how we're going to get people's passwords out of Office 365 and onto the other side necessarily, because they will be on an on-premises Active Directory where we can leverage tools, even including Active Directory migration tool, standard procedures like that for moving objects between on-premises domains or copying them across. And what we have to do is make sure that we don't plan out a migration that's not compatible with the way Office 365 works. So with the identity, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, particularly around things like custom domains in Office 365, where we can't have the custom domain into Office 365 tenants at the same time. So that's a limitation, because often people will be signing in with their user principal name. We also can't synchronize one identity, one person's account, into two tenants at the same time as well. So perhaps in a scenario where someone says, you know what we should do, we should set up two Azure AD Connect servers, and we'll synchronize that set of accounts to another tenant and keep them synchronized to the existing tenant. We'll migrate across, and then we'll deal with identity afterwards. If you plan it that sort of way, where you've done something entirely unsupported, then you will have problems. So it's good so long as you follow those tried and tested practices. And on the Office 365 service configuration, there's different scenarios that this might be. So we can think about one where we talked about a divestiture scenario where perhaps the business is being spun out and it will have its own new tenant for a subset of those users. And it may be in that scenario that we're looking to set them up in a new tenant as is, so they have the same set of capabilities that they do today. That could be, for example, that they will sign in using the same methods. They might use password hash sync. They might have multi-factor authentication enabled. They might have the same external sharing settings, so that if a user goes to share with a trusted partner using OneDrive, then they can. If they need to communicate with somebody over Skype or Teams, and again, that's a set list, then they can. But if they talk to the wrong person, or they try and send data to the wrong organization, then it's going to get caught. And that could be the core service configuration, services that are enabled or disabled, like staff hub or course, or settings for what applications are going to be enabled in Microsoft Teams. But it also might be whether or not they can invite guests into the tenant as well. So there's lots and lots of settings that in that scenario might need to be mapped to what the new business requirements are, or often as is having an as-is state where we go through the settings that are there, and perhaps we need to change some of the wording, change some of the terms and conditions, change some of the disclaimers, put on the new company logo and so on, but things will in essence remain the same in terms of functionality. We won't be exposing any risks. The other scenario can be where we're bringing on a tenant into the organization, and actually the people who are being adopted into the company might have access to tools that they might no longer have access to, and making decisions around will those users get Teams enabled for them, or if they've used specific or rely on specific functionality in Office 365 that's not enabled today, how will we deal with that configuration? Are we going to bring them in to the wider company settings and they'll potentially lose functionality, typical, or will we expand how we allow people to use Office 365? Perhaps we might launch Yammer as part of that, because the business that's merging with us is a big user of Yammer and will continue to be so. So the service configuration is obviously key. Now, the last one is Exchange Mailbox.
And I think, Steve, on that one, just to add to that, that's probably been on our projects. A lot of the hang-up is the agreement on the configuration on some of these projects. So, that it's something that seems basic, just agreeing to the configuration, but it can have a really large impact, particularly if features are going away in the target. So that's something to definitely spend some time in, as we've seen that a lot.
Well, yeah, you're right. And perhaps if it's a divestiture or something similar to that, and the organization that's spinning off the users currently use, perhaps these are third-party mobile device management solution, then it might be that you need to configure additional services that you never had today. And the view of this is often different depending on the team that are responsible for the migration as well. So if the current custodians of the data have been told to get this out of our tenant as quickly and as simply as possible, they'll have a different view to perhaps the new IT team. If they're managing the migration, they will want to get as much as they can out of the new Office 365 subscription they've got, and perhaps do more than they were enabled to do in the previous tenant. So it's not a simple discussion, but technically a lot of this is relatively straightforward to do.
Great. As we were going into too on the Exchange mailboxes, the good news is mailbox data I mean, those of us that have done this kind of work for a while, that's pretty basic. We've all, it's similar concepts. Speed can be an issue, but you want to, and that's part of your tool selection and ensuring that you're ready for it. And as we've noted here, coexistence is can be a challenge, but as long as you're aware of it. Where people get hung up here is ensuring that they're waving users correctly. So when we talked about a stage cutover, ensuring that the users, like users are moving together. And by like users, we mean people that collaborate together in shared mailboxes. That'll solve, 90% of the issues that are referred to here.
And I think having the right expectations is important, because if you're expecting, perhaps the last project you did like this was on premises, and you were able to take full advantage of the coexistence and sharing capabilities that you've got between two on-prem exchange halls, then you're not going to have that level of coexistence available, almost hybrid level coexistence, maybe better actually, between two on-premises organizations. Really, in Office 365, if you examine all of the sharing, calendar sharing, shared mailbox access, you could find that your groups of users that share and collaborate together has very few breakpoints. I did one with about 1,800 users, and we had 3 groups, and that wasn't that meant that some decisions had to be made. The process, the technical capabilities to move that data, however, are there, but coexistence is the absolute challenge. The other good thing about Exchange mailbox migrations for Office 365 is a lot of the important data for compliance is stored in Exchange. So it does mean that although it might be that we can't move people's visible chat histories across, we've got the ability that can have been stored in Exchange Online and can be moved under the hood, which is good news.
Absolutely, because a lot of that is ensuring that those legal discovery records are preserved.
Absolutely, yes.
I think in a lot of cases, OneDrive for Business has a similar story to what we're talking about with Exchange, except there's a lot of good sharing across tenants in OneDrive for Business. But when we talk about sharing, one of the biggest challenges for organizations is shared links do not migrate. And at first, we can kind of sit there and say, okay, that's a pain in the neck. But in a lot of cases, when we think back on how users use this can be, a mixed blessing of problems here, because a lot of times people, especially if you have a policy that allows for anonymous links and for them to be open for years at a time, you probably don't want that to just automatically be reshared on the other side, or that doesn't meet the standard of where it's going to, or no longer needs to be shared at all. So it's a great opportunity, and I know that's kind of turning lemons into lemonade there, but it is part of ensuring that people are compliant with new policies going forward and cleaning up all those old links. So OneDrive for Business, in general, the files move. It's pretty much a straightforward migration for the most part. But again, the shared links, I think, is the #1 item that I see clients, get hung up with.
And when the ability to do that is there, it's not one that people do choose to take advantage of, because just resharing data, perhaps you can map who's going to be in the target organization, limit the resharing to that by whatever means. The links that people are using to click on at the other side, the person that's got access to that data, very often they won't be able to go back in the same way that they normally do. It's a small percentage of users that will go in and look at shared with me to find the data that they've got access to. Most of the time, you'll go back into the links that you've been shared from OneDrive by looking at a thread on Yammer or an email that you got with a bottom attachment, or just a pasted in message, or a Teams chat where it's been pasted in and shared with you there, or in a lot of cases, documents and links that are on files on your intranet, which might not even be in Office 365. So what we can't do is like we could with an on-premises server, put a HTTPS redirect in for any links that hit the service. So because we can't control Office 365's behavior when someone clicks that link, then not only is it, as you say, the oversharing problem, where realistically all of those links should have been cleared up over time. This is an ideal opportunity to make sure people are only sharing the right stuff. But even if those could be brought across, the actual benefit isn't going to be realized due to the places that these links will of course end up. Another perfect example: email out a link to a OneDrive document to somebody outside your organization. There's no way that you're going to be able to go into the recipient's mailbox, whatever external organization, and fix that link.
Excellent. And then client-side reconfiguration, there's a lot of great tools that provide, Quadrotech as one of the providers here, we have a great reconfiguration tool. And this need for the reconfiguration agent comes, really, it's a change in how the endpoint has been addressed. So when we think back to, and Steve made some mentions to when we used to be able to do on-prem M&A activity, a lot of times we would reformat the device or change the domain or do something at the same time as we did the data migrations, and that created a lot of stress for us, having to send people out to the site and a lot of manual work and a lot of long weekends. Because it isn't really necessarily a requirement anymore, now we've entered this other need where that device needs to be reconfigured so that it's pointing to the new tenant at the right time. There's some interesting things you can also do if you're using a modern version of Office with multi-factor authentication. We've seen some clients do things where they revoke the token on the MFA user, and that allows to force a reconfiguration. So there's sometimes you can do it without a reconfiguration tool, and other times you want to use one provided by your vendor to help you get there. So certainly that can be a huge need, and this is really important because your help desk really can't handle all that help desk volume. And one thing to note as we say client-side reconfiguration, when you're talking about laptops, desktops, and Windows devices, that's pretty straightforward. But don't forget the mobile devices. We're seeing that as probably one of the highest help desk volumes for our community. That getting users back online with their mobile device can actually be a significant help desk volume as well.
Yeah, so where I've seen some success with that is where, as part of this process, the organisation says, right, okay, well, it's the scenario where the organisation who's going to look after the environment post-migration want to make their own lives easy. So, which obviously you'd want to do, is where they've been able to provide replacement mobile devices to users as part of this, and then use Intune with one customer used iOS devices, device enrollment program. So when people got their new devices, their new mobile numbers, and so on, after the cutover date, then they had pre-provisioned devices into the new tenant. They didn't have to do that setup themselves. That saves countless hours of people's time, of users' time, who, again, that many of them wouldn't have chose for this to happen, just like ourselves in IT. So anything we can do to solve that. But you're quite right, though. When it comes to things like client-side reconfiguration, we will ideally want to detangle the PC transition, which may at some point be new devices or rebuilt devices, from the actual migration of Office 365 data. We talked a little bit about Exchange coexistence. That's just one problem that needs to be dealt with at the same time as replacing PCs. There's also people who will access OneDrive for Business and share documents or reshare documents with people who they'll expect to have been migrated, accessing Teams, accessing SharePoint online sites, communicating with people over Skype for Business. All of these areas where we don't want the project to be driven by when somebody's going to be in the office and somebody can walk around to their PC and reconfigure their office. We don't want it to be driven by the smaller or the finite amount of resource that we've got to go and visit or update PCs. If it's driven by the PC refresh or reconfiguration, then all of the other things around how people work in the service are going to potentially have a lot more problems. Decoupling the two does mean that we can rely on client-side reconfiguration tools so that the two, well, it's effectively going to be two projects, aren't overlinked and interlinked together.
Excellent. And so SharePoint, and as we round out the good here, we're going to leave it very simply right here that simple sites move easily. And we're going to talk about a lot about more of the complex items and the bad and the ugly here with SharePoint. But document libraries, that's what we mean by that, basic web pages and very basic usage of SharePoint. Those sites move pretty easily. Some of the tools will do the repermission, including our tool that we have for us. So those are pretty simple. But as we move into the bad and the ugly, I think, Steve, we're going to go into pretty good detail here on
Yes.
the other aspects. So the bad. And I think as we start off the bat here, there's a common theme that you're going to see in a lot of these, where in a lot of cases where when we get questions on these, there's a lot more to the question. So a good example is this first one here, power ups and flow. When somebody says, does flow migrate? What they, we have the business use of flow, which is, obviously a great tool that many of us have used. But what they lose track of is flow is, really just the front of a lot of different data sources in the background in a lot of cases. So if that backend SharePoint site isn't moving at the same time, then that's going to really become, even more of a challenge. So you may be able to manually export and import those items, but they're not going to work on the other side without some significant reconfiguration. And you're going to see that as we kind of talk through the bad, where that's a kind of a common theme for a lot of these here.
Yeah, and Power Apps and Flow, that's a good example, along with other technologies like that are used for SharePoint workflow and forms, where immediately most of you listening will think of identify with the scenarios that are going to be problematic. So if expenses forms are using Power Apps and Flow for approval processes to make it easy for people to submit expenses, you wouldn't want to be one of the people that was caught in the middle because there was an issue with the timing of recreating flows, exporting and importing the Power Apps, getting those new apps out to the users, moving the SharePoint site that's holding that data. You wouldn't want it to be your expenses that don't get paid just because of that. But that's the kind of applications that you're likely to see running on Power Apps and Flow. Critical business processes that have been automated in Office 365 and often without a lot of control from IT.
And I think Power BI, Steve, that's kind of a similar story to Power Apps and Flow. I mean, it's a similar problem where, the front end dashboard or whatever you're using for in the Power BI app, it's usually analyzing some sort of backend system or data source. And that migration is really another piece of this puzzle that you have to address when you're trying to plan your Power BI moves.
Yes, and some of these will be IT driven, where perhaps business analyst is using Power BI to interrogate data warehouse using connectors. And often these are going to be identified early on because people know that this is going to be moved across with significant effort from IT involved in building out those dashboards to provide KPIs to management across the business, integration with existing systems. But then there's the user-driven stuff, which is harder to discover, will be used and seen as critical by teams, where those data sources could be CSV files, Excel files, as well as the normal types of data sources that you might expect. So that's a case where you aren't going to necessarily be able to go and recreate all of these on behalf of the users, certainly not with an automated process. And that's where the terms for this is going to be a user comms exercise, where we're going to have to understand how people are using services like that and then guide them through recreating what they've done on the other side.
And Stream, this is a great service that a lot of organizations have had some sizable adoption with. Certainly training organizations, I know we use this a lot internally. And this can be kind of a disappointing for those that are using. It's quite manual. So we have a lot of, to move it, unfortunately, it's a download of the video and then actually re-uploading the video and resetting up all the metadata for that as well. And you lose all the play history and things like that as well. So that can be quite disappointing. And again, unfortunately, it's one of these manual downloads and reconfiguration, and it can be pretty impactful for organizations that have relied on this.
And this is similar to Delve that we mentioned earlier, where it's not necessarily some of it isn't necessarily a service where we're migrating data, but trending videos like most relevant files in Delve are based on who's viewing what, not just view history, but what's most relevant to them, and that configuration that users have set as to what audiences these are shared with. And as well as just the rote download and re-upload of the videos, then people may need to go and switch languages for certain videos to say what language that is in, if it's going to be transcripted. And in a lot of cases, if it's videos, training videos where there is talking heads, and we want them to, or the person, the trainer who's uploaded these wants people to be able to see who's talking at one time in stream. You know, some of the cool stuff that stream does that is useful. Then they'll need to go back through some of those videos, and if it's picked up 3 people instead of 2, and we need to go in and combine those together, then all of those little things, tagging of videos and so on, where these cloud-first applications don't have those same APIs for automating what we've been able to perhaps do with the services that came from on-premises. That's difficult stuff, and it's not something that we've always got a tool for.
Excellent. The other thing to note just before we move on here is keep in mind with your team's recordings, they are stored in streams. So that is something, if that's a heavy feature that you're using in your org, then there's a larger impact there that you may not fully realize.
And that's only going to get worse as well over time.
Absolutely. Planner. Steve, you want to address Planner?
Yeah, so we'll show you what the problem looks like in a little bit. But plans are based on Office 365 groups. So when you look at tools that can migrate Office 365 groups, they usually mean the Exchange bits and the SharePoint bits, but not necessarily the planner, the buckets, the tasks inside them, the checklist that people have built, and also the people that are attached to them, and the documents and attachments that they've stored on those, which of course back off to SharePoint as well. So there's lots of things like in Planner that just can't be migrated across, and they can't necessarily be cut and pasted either, because even if you ask people to just copy and paste things across, then they'll find things that don't work. Yammer is a case where in a lot of scenarios, the data that you can export might not be the data that you actually want to be able to bring over to the other tenant. If you could do that, perhaps if you're merging your data into a tenant as part of a merger or an acquisition, then you wouldn't want to replace your existing Yammer network with the one that you're bringing in. There used to be a way of doing a Yammer network move in these kind of scenarios, but often that wasn't really desirable. And if you're divesting, you're spinning out a part of the company, then we can do an export of Yammer, but that might include data that you don't want to bring into the other side. So the Yammer data export is fine, but again, there's no API that allows us to recreate the entire history of the conversations that have occurred in the organization. And usually a successful Yammer adoption project has been focused on changing that culture, people working out loud and relying on that organizational history of knowledge that people can depend upon. And in a tenant-to-tenant move, there's the potential that hard work people have used to build those communities is going to be lost, or people will have to start again to bring that knowledge across, because there's not a way of just migrating in the same way that we can with data like Exchange and OneDrive data and placing it back. So a conversation from 2 years ago is placed into the other tenant as if this migration had never happened. And as your mic, that's another kind of fish altogether.
Yeah, I think Azure's one. It's if you've got 100 Azure items deployed, and sometimes that's a really low number. Each one is a whole different migration project in itself, and I think this is just scratching the surface here, and we're going to focus this more towards the Office 365 workloads. But for those of you that are undertaking a project right now, you really want to go ahead and run an inventory of what is out there and start understanding what this is going to be and planning that project. A lot of people lose track of what's out there, and each one of these applications that you've deployed is going to need a mini migration plan, or sometimes not so many of a migration plan. So really getting ahead of it and seeing what you have is really, really important. So when you're doing your due diligence, really reach out and understand what has been deployed in those Azure environments so that you can be prepared for it. All right, now we're going to move on to the ugly. So Teams is a difficult one, and Teams is we absolutely love it at Quadrotech. I know, Steve, you're a very big fan of it, and a lot of us have really driven adoption for it and have really enjoyed it. But we're in an awkward situation when it comes to migrating it, because the realities are the APIs still don't fully exist for us to be able to migrate everything in Teams. There was a release at the end of last year that allows us to recreate teams, modify the members in them, and because of the file sections in SharePoint, we're able to actually do some move the files tab, and that's what we've been providing at Quadrotech for the migrations. But the actual chat history and the metadata that goes around it, which is a lot of times even more important than just the individual chat history, we still don't have APIs for that. Microsoft is making, go ahead.
And this is where, it's someone that looks at a lot of the different tools on the market. There's a lot of vendors out there who do say that they can migrate teams, which is a good headline. But knowing the similar background to you, well, we know that that's blatantly, not possible, because the API isn't there for doing the ingestion of the data to the other side. We can't migrate the data. So when you do actually start investigating these solutions, you find that some of them are no better than going into a team and copying and pasting the data, as if it was a web page. And it's not good at all. It's not it's something that might look good in a demo, but it's not something that is a real migration. I'm sorry to say. So I think you need to be very careful when you're looking at the capabilities of tools on the market, because migrating teams is the reason why it's in the uglies. It's migrating all these things that we've talked about that are in the bad. You can attach flows, you can attach power-ups to it. You've got the SharePoint side of it. So you've got all of these. Every single thing in Office 365 can surface itself pretty much within Microsoft Teams. So yeah, the bits that can migrate with Quadrotech, that's the realistic scale of the most advanced capabilities of what's really, truly, honestly being migrated in tools on the market today, at least in my opinion.
Thanks, Steve. And that's a lot of what we're, once the APIs are available, I think you're going to see the migration vendors, obviously Quadrotech being one of them, pushing a lot to get that ready and out for our clients. And that metadata is essential. Just as you said, copy and pasting the data over loses a lot of it. So, there's certainly more to come in this space. And this is part of that category of what's getting better. We didn't even have these capabilities a few months ago. So it is getting better with time. So SharePoint, Steve, that's your specialty. So why don't I let you take that here?
Well, when it comes to being an MVP, it's not for SharePoint. So I'm not going to try and pull the wool. But Content and Code are the UK's or the world's one of the biggest partners that have focused, got a big team of SharePoint focused people. So when it comes to tenant-to-tenant migrations, then we start with the good bit, where it is simple document migrations. But obviously, we have a lot of customers that are advanced users of SharePoint. They might have built their intranet on it. We sell a very popular product which works well on top of SharePoint, is easy to implement. But of course, as you start using capabilities, like you use it as your digital workspace, you use it as your intranet for the organization, then you've got a custom application sitting on top of SharePoint. And a lot of our clients that we work with, they're also using SharePoint as the base for building their business applications, not just Power Apps and Flow, but very complex applications that are web-based apps, live in the cloud, built on top of things like the SharePoint framework, but they're providing critical functions for the business. Now, moving those across, it's not just going to be something where we're migrating a SharePoint list and a bit of custom code. Like we had on the last slide, they'll often link into Azure services as well. They'll do a lot of very complex things, and we can't just use a migration tool to move that across, because it's well and beyond the capabilities of it, that any migration product could match. So if like many organizations, you've become an advanced user of SharePoint in those kind of areas where you've got custom development sitting on top of it, then often if you've bought a product from a vendor or you've had custom development to implement that, then you might need those same people back to re-implement it into that other tenant. And often that's not going to be a big surprise, because there'll also be a pre-prod development tenant, test tenant that sits alongside for those specific custom applications. The other scenario, and this is where things like the TSA comes into play, is where there's versioning and history of those documents that might be needed as well, because it may be, as you get today, that there's lots of different versions of the document in SharePoint. If you've used the Office client, you'll see the autosave button in the top left-hand corner. That autosave button regularly saves a new version of the document to SharePoint. And in many cases, if you need to go back to the version of a document 6 months ago, that's a rarity. And when that happens, then it may be that things like the TSA can come into play. But in some cases, the requirement might be that you've got to get everything out of that tenant, including all of the previous versions. And that's when things start to get very complicated.
Absolutely. As we talk about more complicated domains, so we talk about custom domains. So this really stems to the domains can only live in one tenant at once. So contoso.com can only be in one Microsoft Office 365 tenant at a time. For cutover migrations, you can move it, and certainly many have, and it's a complicated chain of events, but certainly doable and repeatable. But for stage migrations, this can be a really large challenge, because not only does the user's SMTP address typically change, but the UPN does as well. There's certainly some ways around, with a message rewrite service doing that. Some people will, put in these little third-party connectors to do that. We tend to recommend a stronger solution, one that specializes in mail routing for doing that. But Steve, I think one of the biggest impacts here for the stage migrations is the user's UPN has to change, and that's, to me, the biggest impact of this, even more than the email address.
Oh, absolutely. So, certainly, it's a sigh of relief if you ask the question, are they going to have the same email address when they move over? Or they might keep it, they might bring it across, but no, we're going to rebrand them, or they'll have the new, or they'll have the company name that they're moving them into. That's a good scenario. But if it is that they're going to need to keep that same domain, it's going to be a staged migration. Yeah, that's when things get more complicated. And of course, you don't want to compromise mail security during that migration by using a very bare bones email solution for an outbound mail for the coexistence of those domains as well. And so you absolutely must, because that could be, again, a dangerous step for security, which we can't forget about when we're going through this process. And some of the solutions that you even read, like Microsoft saying, redirect your domain to an invalid address during the transition period. Well, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's seen it take a very long time to get domains out of tenants in the past. So we do need to be conscious that something could go wrong while we move that domain across. And as an email system admin, you're going to get hammered if messages can't be found that have came in during that process, because then you're relying on the sending server. Not all of them follow the rules in the same way, to retry and send that message when you finally get the MX record moved over to the new tenant, custom domain in, and everything up and running. It's an area where you don't want to have to make mistakes, and you want to be able to test this as thoroughly as possible. But as you say, scenarios where the UPN is changing, very, very complicated. Though single sign-on technologies can help get around this, but it can be a challenge, especially if you're going to have to give people a temporary UPN before you move into the final domain.
Absolutely. Like you said, it's always a relief when they're taking on the new branding, but when they don't, there's options, but unfortunately they can have user impact. And, as you said too, data security and uptime, the other problem can be obviously mail flow issues of using a bare bones solution can really be a larger concern there.
Yes.
So the difficult, so Steve, do you want to hop into the difficulty? Or I know you put together some great slides
Yeah,
here.
yeah. So I thought it's probably worth visualizing what some of this looks like, and I didn't have to go far to give you some examples, and it's just a few. So Power BI dashboards, Power Apps, and Flow. So if you go to the next slide, Mike, then you'll see this is in my Office 365 tenants, and I'm just showing you all the podcast listens I get to the All About 365 podcast. Download it now. Well, we get listens from all over the world. So for a demo last week, I spent 5 minutes putting together a Power BI dashboard with that data. Now, as a user in my tenant, it didn't take me very long to do that. But this is something that wouldn't just simply migrate across, because if we have a look at the Power BI dashboard itself, then you'll see that we've got connections to different data sets. Now, none of that's going to migrate. So if we were to migrate me in Teams, then my Power BI dashboard, it disappears. Or even if we try to link back to it, then we haven't migrated that data across. And who knows where that data lives? In this case, it happens to be Excel files, SharePoint. What if it's somewhere else? Or how do we migrate or coordinate migrating that data from my OneDrive at the same time as the team data that's showing up there? So a complex problem, but one that's very easy to get yourself into, because that's just me with an E5 license. I'm allowed to create a dashboard, so I do it and I share it with the team. And then if we have a look at the next slide, then you'll see Microsoft Planner. And this is an example of what can happen even before a tenant migration, because Planner hooks in very closely to SharePoint. So here in the middle, you'll see recorded episodes, episode 27, and I've got a link to a picture. Now that's something that wouldn't just migrate across, even if a user was instructed to copy and paste the items, recreate them, then they'd have to go through quite a long process to go and find the migrated data to recreate it, because that picture there, because I've deleted it out of SharePoint, it can't be found anymore. It's gone. And in a migration scenario, that's something that's going to hit us almost immediately. And it means that if people have spent a lot of time and effort building up plans, then you need to consider the timing of how they'll recreate them. So in this case, it's going to be after they've got the backing data behind Planner or behind the Office 365 group supporting it moved across. Or if they're linking that out of another SharePoint site, it's going to provide some complex problems that are going to be very difficult to discover. And the last one is Power BI. So this is a really simple app built out of just Power BI, Power Apps, Flow, and a SharePoint list. Easy to put together. It's sort of half an hour or an evening sort of work. It's something that, again, a user could easily create, given access to the right tools. And Microsoft encouraged this, right? You can build an app like this out of a SharePoint list by going into the SharePoint list and looking on the right-hand side for Power Apps, and then clicking down and then choosing create a Power App, and it'll make a mobile version, very similar to the one you see on the screen. Now, it's got its data source as a SharePoint list here. So even if we export as a user the list itself, then we'll still need to reattach that data source back on the other side. So again, coordinating the migration of the SharePoint list data that's going to be used. And then a process for them to then go and reattach all those fields back on the other side. It's possible to export these, but it's not something we can do at scale as IT admins. So that links over to SharePoint. And if you just advance the slides, then you see, there we go. Then you see we've got simple list data, again, stuff that can be migrated, but we've got a flow attached to it. So if we have a look at the flow, then we'll find that this is a can of worms that we're opening. So if you go to the next slide, Mike, then you'll see that we've got a trigger from flow when the item is created or modified. Then if the status value changes to completed an email, then it's going to trigger sending out a Word document based on a template. So we rely on where that's stored in SharePoint as well. So we're looking at a very simple Power App and flow based on a SharePoint list that's already got dependencies in multiple places that are hard to programmatically discover. Now, imagine you've been pushing for adoption of all of these services quite rightly, and this has been happening 10 times, 100 times, maybe more within your organization. Then you need to understand that some of the stuff is going to be very ugly, and realistically, you're not going to have time as an IT organization, as an IT admin, to go and redo all of this on behalf of your users, nor are the tools that can untangle all of this. A lot of the things that you need to get right are in the planning, but some of this is going to rely on effort by the users. Because, of course, remember, Microsoft didn't do this to you. The IT department didn't, or most likely didn't decide that this was going to happen. More than likely, the business did make this decision, and this is one of the consequences of it. So ask yourself the question, how many of these exist in your tenant today? And in many cases, it's probably going to be more than you think.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So we're going to hop into the debate. We are a little tight on time. Steve, do you want to pick one of these topics and maybe we'll go into that and then we'll go into question and answer?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first one, what trends are we seeing? Is this getting easier or harder? We had a chat about this the other day, actually. And what do you think?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good one because I actually think it's getting easier in more situations because we're seeing more options. People are becoming more routine, and I stand kind of in the camp too. As more projects have happened, project management organizations are able to share notes, or firms that specialize in guiding firms have gotten kind of better at doing these. Where it's even a year ago there was just absolute panic when you had to do these. So I see that these projects are getting easier to do, but I think you have a differing opinion on it.
Yeah, I think the things that we talked about in sort of the good, the bad, and so on, they're getting more routine, as you say. But where I work, we spend a lot of time trying to get people to adopt lots and lots of parts of Office 365. Success for us does look like more than just email and Teams. It's trying to use all of the services that people have bought. So imagine you spend a lot of time and effort and money, resource, getting people to use all of these services. So we see that, and then of course, a client of ours will divest or have something like this happen. Which means that actually the migration of a year ago, which was fairly routine, normal sort of usage in the tenant, whilst they were scaling up, the level of integrations, the amount of ugly things that we see was relatively low. But now we're seeing probably project by project throughout some of the larger organizations, the ugly stuff come up more often, and there being a greater desire to try and solve these issues.
So I think we can quickly go into the second topic here too. Is if you need to if you need to merge tenants sometime in the next 12 months, what should I do now? So you and I also had a debate on this earlier, and I'm in the camp of don't enable anything until you've done it because you're adding complexity and cost to your project. But you had another point too, which is also valid to bring up here.
Yeah, I see. My gut feeling would be the same thing. Don't adopt any more services. Don't start that voice project for Microsoft Teams. Stop people building out Power Apps. But then also, you're going to be paying for Office 365 for the next year. So you probably should also want to get the most out of that investment. So there's some balance there where you need to be conscious of what you might be getting yourself into. But there's also going to be some benefits, which might be bigger benefits overall. If you launch these services knowing the risks, than not doing it at all. Should you stop a Teams launch and stick with just email and stop people from using OneDrive? Some organisations that would be their default. But what does that? How does that impact productivity? How does that drive the value of that very expensive Office 365 purchase?
Well, I think expenses are interesting because there's so many aspects to that side, because there's the project move cost, but to your point, productivity is also extremely expensive. So if deploying teams suddenly will save you $500,000 a year, or deploying Power BI or some of these other services. To your point, you already have the investment. It's a difficult decision for organizations to make. So with that, I think, Steve, we're gonna have to skip ahead to Q&A. Laura from our team here at Quadrotech is on the line. Laura, do we have some questions that have come in here?
Hi guys, yep, we do have a couple. The first being, how do you handle situations where some mailboxes are still on-prem?
So Steve, do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
So this can be a challenge because there's certainly some organizations, although they've adopted Office 365, they still have, or they're in hybrid mode, so they still have some mailboxes that are sitting on-prem. There's two aspects to that. You have to find out why are they on-prem, and if there's a reason that's technical, you now have another project that you've got to address in this. There are Cloud Commander, we have a on-prem connector, so you can, in the same solution, manage and bring those mailboxes over, and they can go to an on-prem version of Exchange as well instead of Office 365. However, what's important to note there is getting at the key issue there of why are they on-prem to begin with, because that, like I said, is likely going to be another project that you're going to have to address.
Okay. Next question. Let's see, this is from Brian. He asked, has Microsoft ever announced or considered announced a consideration or willingness to the possibility of allowing a domain to be set up in 2 tenants at once for the migration purposes?
I don't think we can answer on behalf of Microsoft some of those questions. The announcements around what they would do for tenant-to-tenant migrations were in sessions from Ignite 2017, I think. So not a lot has changed since then, but the core of it is nothing has happened or been released since then. So that
was a famous session where everything was promised, and unfortunately, we're waiting for the results from that.
Yeah, I did a session at Ignite 2018 on this topic, and I hoped I'd be told that magic was around the corner and all our problems would be solved, but I wasn't. So I wouldn't expect by holding out for another 6 months before you start your project that these things are going to be solved. But obviously they know of the issues that this causes and have people working on trying to solve some of it. But it's not an easy problem to crack.
Absolutely.
Yep, thanks.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Let's see. How do you handle Outlook client profiles for migrated users as you need to recreate them? Any automated process or agents?
So Quadrotech provides a reconfiguration agent. We have another version that's going to be launching with enhancements, but it will handle that. There's one piece that we didn't talk about here that Steve, you bring up in a lot of cases, which is the bandwidth considerations.
Yeah.
Because the mailbox GUIDs are changing, you actually have to re-download your Outlook cache. So a lot of times in migration projects, we focus on bandwidth of just moving the data for migration, but we also have to keep in mind that those clients are going to start reconfiguring or re-downloading that cache, and that can be a really large burden. Sometimes you'll do a group policy to try to manipulate the cache and make it small and then grow it out, or there's some other coping mechanisms that we can talk about. So we provide a tool to facilitate the reconfiguration so that you don't need to. As we talked about in the webinar a little bit, there are some tricks you can do to alleviate having to use a reconfiguration agent, but you've really got to be kind of lucky that you had a certain configuration in order to leverage that.
All right.
Okay, we got time for one more?
Yep, I think so. So we got a question from James. Any advice on how to select the best migration tools for projects, as it doesn't seem any one tool migrates every workload? Do you sometimes use multiple tools?
Yeah, so that's a funny question to ask in a Quadrotech webinar, because obviously there's differing views on this. So where I work, we're fairly independent on the tools that we use. And that means we don't always use the same set of tools for every migration. Ultimately, though, 9 times out of 10, what we see is people need to be pragmatic because, as James says, it can be very expensive to buy the best tool for everything that needs to be done in a very specific way. And of course, all of the tools on the market that are best at one thing but not very good at another, and best at another thing and not very good at something else, don't necessarily work together well. So ultimately, you could have 20 different tools that can all do very specific things, but they're not going to work together well. They're going to be very, very expensive. They're going to make the project take longer than it needs to. So we're going to rely on being pragmatic with the choice of tool to meet the client's needs. And ultimately, that's what it's all about, what people need to get done and are happy to live with on a project like this, where it is an imperfect world that we're living in.
Great. Well, Steve, I got to thank you for joining us in the webinar this evening. We also have a great ebook that we've developed with several other MVPs as well, and it's a great read if you are undertaking a project. This is a great recommendation that we have. It's a free ebook that we offer with some independence, and then obviously if there's anything we can help with, certainly feel free to reach out. Steve, thank you again. I appreciate you joining us, and
thank you.
Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.